the story of the woman who had become the ultimate symbol of royal decadence and the ultimate victim of a nation's rage, does not begin with the smell of gunpowder or the shadow of the guillotine. It begins in the soft, Baroque light of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. In the year 1755, long before the world knew her as Marie Antoinette, she was Maria Antonia, the 15th child of the legendary Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, a woman who ruled with a heart of oak and a mind of iron. Antonia's birth was marked by a chilling omen that many would later call a prophecy of ruin. On the very day she was born, a massive and terrifying earthquake leveled the city of Lisbon, killing tens of thousands and shaking the foundations of the European world. But in the nursery of Vienna, Antonia grew up as a creature of pure light. She had the porcelain skin of the Habsburgs, strawberry blonde hair that glowed like gold, and a spirit that was far too restless for the dusty books and strict lessons of her tutors. She was not raised to be a scholar. She was not trained to understand the complex gears of economics or the dark arts of war. She was raised for one purpose: to be a royal pawn, a piece of flesh to be traded in the high-stakes game of European diplomacy. Her mother, the Empress, looked at her youngest daughter and saw a way to end the centuries of bloody warfare between Austria and France, a way to cement an alliance through the oldest method known to kings: marriage at the age of only 12. Antonia's childhood was effectively ended by a single drop of ink on a marriage contract. She was to be sent to Paris to marry the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, a boy she had never seen and whose language she could barely speak. From that day on, her life became a systematic process of erasing her Austrian soul. Her teeth were painfully and brutally straightened by French dentists. Her wardrobe was burned and replaced with the latest stiff fashions of the French court, and her very name was stripped away, becoming the more elegant, more French Marie Antoinette. In the spring of 1770, at just 14 years old, the young girl was forced to leave behind her mother, her siblings, and the only home she had ever known. She traveled in a massive, lumbering procession of 57 carriages, crossing the vast landscapes of Europe toward the border of France. She arrived at a small, desolate island in the middle of the Rhine River, known as No Man's Land, where a terrifying and symbolic ritual took place, known as the handover, in a specially constructed wooden pavilion. The young girl was taken into a room and stripped naked in front of a group of French strangers. She was forced to leave behind every thread of Austrian clothing, every scrap of her past life. Even her beloved pet dog was snatched away, as French law dictated that a future Queen of France must retain nothing of a foreign power. She was reborn in that cold room, dressed in silks that felt like lead, and led across the threshold into a country that already viewed her with a deep, ancient suspicion. As her carriage rolled toward the palace of Versailles, the crowds cheered for her incredible beauty, but beneath the cheers, the whispers were already spreading like a poison to the people of Paris. She was Lautrec, the Austrian woman, a spy sent to the heart of their kingdom to drain their wealth. She finally arrived at Versailles, the most decadent and suffocating court in the entire world, a place where every blink of an eye was a ceremony and every sigh was a scandal. She met her husband, Louis, and found a boy who was as shy as he was awkward, a teenager who preferred the cold iron of his locksmith's forge to the warmth of his beautiful new bride. On their wedding night, as a massive thunderstorm shook the very foundations of the palace, the young couple lay in a grand bed surrounded by the entire royal court, a ceremony of public bedding that was as humiliating as it was ancient. But the night ended not in the union of two dynasties, but in a heavy, freezing silence that would last for 7 agonizing years. The marriage was not consummated, a failure that would become the primary weapon used by her enemies to destroy her reputation. Marie Antoinette was a girl lost in a labyrinth of mirrors, a princess sold for a peace treaty, and she was about to discover that in the glittering golden halls of Versailles, a queen without a son was a woman without a future. The butterfly had landed in a spider's web, and the first threads of the revolution were already beginning to tighten around her neck. Versailles in the 1770s was not just a palace of gold and glass. It was a sprawling, decadent theater where every person was an actor and every gesture was a political statement. For the teenage Marie Antoinette, it was a nightmare disguised as a beautiful dream. She woke up every morning to a ritual known as the levee, a ceremony where dozens of noble women would crowd into her bedroom to watch her perform the most private acts of her day. According to the strict and suffocating rules of French etiquette, the highest-ranking woman in the room had the sole honor of handing the queen her chemise. But if a high-ranking lady walked into the room at that moment, the garment had to be passed from hand to hand while the young queen stood naked, shivering and humiliated in the drafty hall. Marie Antoinette hated these ridiculous ceremonies from the very first day. She found them to be an absurd waste of life, and her refusal to hide her boredom or her disdain made her immediate and powerful enemies among the old aristocracy. She was a girl of 15, surrounded by a court that lived on gossip and breathed scandal like oxygen. Her most dangerous and vocal rival was Madame du Barry, the king's official mistress, a woman of low birth but immense beauty and power who saw the young Antoinette as a direct threat to her influence over the aging King Louis XV. For months, the entire French government was paralyzed by a silent, bitter war between these two women, as Antoinette, encouraged by her pious aunts, refused to speak a single word to du Barry, a silence that nearly caused a catastrophic diplomatic crisis between France and Austria. Her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, wrote frantic and scolding letters from Vienna, telling her to be a woman and use her charms to secure her position. But Antoinette was stubborn, she was lonely, and she was drowning in a world that didn't want her there. She sought refuge in a small, tight circle of favorites, showering them with expensive gifts, high titles, and public affection. A move that alienated the rest of the nobility who felt bypassed and insulted by this Austrian outsider. Her private life was under a microscope, and the fact that she still had not produced an heir after years of marriage became the talk of every salon in Europe. The public began to believe the cruelest rumors, that she was immoral, that she was a spy, or that she was secretly funneling the nation's gold back to her family in Austria. Her husband, Louis, was a kind but pathologically shy man who preferred the solitude of his locksmith's forge and the quiet of the forest to the drama of the court. He was unable to provide her with the emotional or physical intimacy she so desperately craved, and his physical condition, which made intimacy painful, remained a secret that tormented the young queen for 7 long years. In her frustration, Antoinette turned to the only thing she could control, her image. She became the ultimate, extravagant icon of fashion, spending staggering fortunes on towering wigs that were sometimes 3 feet high, decorated with feathers, jewels, and even tiny models of sailing ships to celebrate French naval victories. She spent hours every day with her hairdresser, Leonard, and her dressmaker, Rose Bertin, creating gowns of such incredible complexity that they were copied by every woman in France. She was the queen of fashion, But while she was decorating her hair with diamonds, the people of France were beginning to starve in the streets of Paris. A series of bad harvests and the massive, crushing debt from France's endless wars had pushed the country to the absolute brink of collapse. The peasants saw the Queen's extravagant lifestyle as a direct, bloody insult to their own suffering. They began to call her Madame Deficit, blaming her personally for the empty treasury, even though her spending was only a tiny fraction of the royal budget. Antoinette was living in a bubble of silk, gold, and ostrich feathers. She spent her nights at masked balls in the city and her days gambling away thousands of gold coins in the palace. She was trying to escape the emptiness of her marriage and the hostility of the court, but she didn't realize that every diamond she bought was another stone in the wall that was being built between her and her subjects. The scandals were growing darker, the pamphlets were becoming more obscene, and the very air in Versailles was becoming thick with the scent of an approaching rebellion. She was a child playing with fire in a house made of dry wood and silk, and the first sparks of the revolution were already falling on the floor. She had arrived as a butterfly, but she was now a target, and the silence of her husband's bed was being filled by the roar of a hungry nation that was tired of kings. By the late 1770s, Marie Antoinette had reached a breaking point with the suffocating and soul-crushing rituals of Versailles. She felt like a rare bird trapped in a cage made of mirrors, and she became desperate for a place where she could breathe, laugh, and exist without 100 judgmental eyes watching her every move. Her husband, King Louis XVI, who had finally ascended the throne as a shy and overwhelmed monarch, gave her a gift that would become both her greatest joy and her ultimate political undoing: the Petit Trianon. This was a small, elegant chateau on the vast grounds of Versailles, but Antoinette turned it into her own private and secret kingdom. She declared that within the walls of the Trianon, she was no longer the Queen of France, but a private woman. She banned the high nobility from entering without her personal invitation, a move that deeply insulted the oldest and most powerful families of France. She even made the king himself ask for her formal permission before he was allowed to visit her there. She spent a staggering fortune creating a hameau, or a rustic hamlet, a fake peasant village with a working mill, a dairy, and a farmhouse, where she and her close friends would dress in simple, white muslin dresses and pretend to live a simple, pastoral life away from the world's problems. She wanted to be close to nature, inspired by the romantic and philosophical ideas of the time. But to the starving, desperate people of Paris, this was the ultimate and most bloody insult. While they were dying in the mud for a single piece of black bread, the Queen was playing peasant in a golden playground that cost millions of livres of the taxpayers' money. The rumors about her grew darker, more vicious, and more obscene by the day. She was accused of having secret, midnight orgies in the gardens of the Trianon, of being a heartless mother who ignored her own children, and of being a secret agent who was funneling French gold to her brother in Austria to fuel his foreign wars. But the event that truly shattered her reputation forever and turned her into a villain in the eyes of history was the affair of the diamond necklace, a scandal so complex, so bizarre, and so filled with lies that it seemed like a work of dark fiction. A clever con artist named Jean de la Motte, who claimed to be of royal blood, hatched a brilliant plan to steal a necklace of staggering value, a piece containing 650 massive diamonds that the previous king had commissioned for his favorite mistress. Jean convinced a powerful and wealthy cardinal, Prince de Rohan, who was desperate for the Queen's favor and political influence, that Marie Antoinette secretly wanted the necklace but couldn't buy it openly because of the country's massive debt. Jean went as far as hiring a prostitute who looked exactly like the Queen to meet the Cardinal in the pitch-black gardens of Versailles at midnight. Giving him a single rose and a promise of royal love, the Cardinal, completely fooled by the darkness and his own ambition, bought the necklace on credit and handed it to Jean, who promptly broke it apart and sold the diamonds piece by piece in the back streets of London. When the jeweler didn't receive his payment, he went directly to the Queen, who was absolutely baffled, terrified and horrified. She had never wanted the necklace. She had never even seen the Cardinal in private, and she had never authorized the purchase of such a vulgar and expensive piece. But the damage was already done, and it was irreversible. The king, in a misguided attempt to be fair, ordered a public trial to clear the Queen's name. But the trial had the exact opposite effect. The public, who were already primed by years of pamphlets to hate her, believed that the Queen had used the Cardinal to get the diamonds and then betrayed him to cover her tracks. She was portrayed in thousands of illegal, dirty pamphlets as a greedy, manipulative woman who would bankrupt an entire nation for a single piece of jewelry, even though she was completely innocent of this specific crime. The diamond necklace affair was the final nail in the coffin of the monarchy's prestige. It proved to the people that the Queen was a woman of loose morals and endless greed, and it turned the nobility against her for her unqueenly and secretive behavior. Antoinette was now the most hated person in the entire kingdom. She began to realize that no matter what she did, no matter how many children she had or how much charity she gave, she could never win back the heart of France. She retreated further into the Trianon, surrounding herself with a few loyal friends and her one true secret love, the Swedish Count Axel von Fez, a handsome and devoted soldier who would remain loyal to her until the very shadow of the guillotine. She was a mother now, having finally given birth to children after 7 years of being called barren. But even her motherhood was used as a weapon against her. Her first child was a girl, and the court mocked her for failing to provide a male dauphin. When she finally had a son, the public whispered that the king was not the father. She was a woman caught in a storm of lies, and as the 1780s drew to a close, the very air in France began to vibrate with the sound of an approaching earthquake. The national debt was uncontrollable. The people were hungry for bread and for blood, and the old fortress of the Bastille was waiting in the shadows of Paris. She had lived her life in a dream of silk, flowers, and diamonds. But the awakening was going to be written in the blood of kings and the fire of a new world. The summer of 1789 was unlike any other in the history of France. The air in Paris was thick with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and a hunger that had turned into a primal rage. While Marie Antoinette sat in the gardens of Versailles, still trying to believe that the storm would pass, the city of Paris was exploding on July 14th. The people did the unthinkable. They stormed the Bastille, a massive stone fortress that was the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny, and they tore it down stone by stone with their bare hands. When the news reached the palace, the king asked if it was a revolt, but his advisor famously replied, "No, sire. It is a revolution for Marie Antoinette." The fall of the Bastille was the moment her world of silk and mirrors shattered forever. She pleaded with the king to flee, to take the children and find safety in the countryside or at the border. But Louis, paralyzed by indecision and a desperate hope to be loved by his people, refused to move. The queen began to realize that she was no longer just a woman. She was a target, a symbol of everything the people hated. The pamphlets in Paris were now calling for her head, describing her as a monster who fed on the blood of the poor. But the true turning point came in October, when the price of bread in Paris reached a point where mothers could no longer feed their children. Thousands of market women, tough and fueled by a mother's desperation, gathered in the streets. They grabbed kitchen knives, pikes, and even cannons, and they began a slow, rhythmic march toward Versailles, 12 miles through the pouring rain and the thick mud. They were screaming for bread, but they were also screaming for the Queen, calling her the Austrian and vowing to tear her to pieces. Inside the palace, the royal family was trapped. The king was out hunting when the march began, and by the time he returned, the gates of Versailles were surrounded by a sea of angry, shouting women. The night that followed was a nightmare of shadows and steel. In the early hours of the morning, a group of armed men and women found a secret door and broke into the palace. They slaughtered the Queen's bodyguards in the hallways, their blood staining the white marble floors. Marie Antoinette woke up to the sound of screams and the clashing of swords just outside her bedroom door. She barely had time to throw on a shawl and run through a secret passage to the king's apartments before the mob burst into her room and shredded her bed with bayonets. Thinking she was still inside, the royal family huddled together in the dark, listening to the crowd outside calling for the Queen to show herself on the balcony. It was a death sentence, but Marie Antoinette, with a courage that stunned even her enemies, stepped out onto the balcony alone. She stood there in the grey morning light, facing thousands of muskets and pikes, her head held high, her arms empty. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at the mob, and for a few seconds, the sheer power of her dignity silenced the crowd. Someone lowered their gun, then another, and then the cry changed from "kill her" to "the Queen." The Queen. She had won a temporary reprieve, but the price was her home. The mob demanded that the royal family return with them to Paris, to live in the Tuileries Palace, which was effectively a prison. The procession back to the city was a scene from hell. The king and queen's carriage was surrounded by women carrying the heads of the slaughtered bodyguards on pikes, singing that they were bringing back the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy. Marie Antoinette sat in the carriage for hours, staring out at the rain, watching the faces of the people who now owned her life. She had left Versailles for the last time. The golden age was dead, and the woman who had once been the butterfly of Austria was now a captive of the French people. She was no longer playing a part in a play. She was a prisoner in a revolution that was only just beginning to taste blood. By the spring of 1791, the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris had become a suffocating prison for the royal family. The Queen felt the walls closing in. She was watched by revolutionary guards even in her private moments, and every word she whispered was reported back to the National Assembly. Marie Antoinette, ever the daughter of the Empress, could no longer endure this humiliation. She began to plan a desperate and dangerous escape, a plan that she believed was their only hope for survival. She worked in the shadows with her most loyal friend, Count Axel von Fersen, spending months organizing a secret carriage, false passports, and a network of loyal soldiers waiting at the border. She was the driving force behind the plan, while the king remained hesitant, caught between his fear of the people and his duty to the crown. Finally, on the night of June 20th, 1791, exactly 1 year before the monarchy would truly collapse, the plan was set into motion in the dead of night. The royal family, dressed in the clothes of common servants, and slipped out of a side door of the palace. Marie Antoinette wore a simple grey dress and a large hat to hide her famous face. They climbed into a heavy, lumbering carriage known as a berlin and began a slow, agonizing journey toward the border of Normandy, where a loyal army was waiting to protect them. But from the very beginning, the escape was cursed by a series of fatal mistakes. The carriage was too large and too slow, attracting attention at every village they passed. The king, in his incredible naivety, kept sticking his head out of the window to speak to the local people, thinking they would never recognize their sovereign in such a humble setting. As they reached the small town of Saint-Manon, the king's face was recognized by a local postmaster named Droot, who compared the man in the carriage to the image of the king on a paper assignat note. Droot jumped on his horse and took a shortcut through the woods. Arriving at the next village, Versailles, before the royal family, he alerted the local authorities and blocked the bridge with a heavy cart. When the royal carriage arrived in the middle of the night, it was stopped by an angry, suspicious crowd of peasants armed with pitchforks and muskets. The family was forced out of the carriage and taken into the small, cramped house of a local grocer. Marie Antoinette sat in that kitchen for hours, her hair reportedly turning white from the sheer stress of the night. She pleaded with the grocer's wife, begging her to let them go for the sake of her children. But the woman coldly replied that her own husband and children came first. The news of the king's flight spread through the countryside like wildfire, and by morning thousands of National Guards arrived to take them back to Paris. The return journey was a 3-day funeral procession of the monarchy. The carriage was surrounded by thousands of shouting, spitting people who called the king a traitor and the queen a foreign spy. They were forced to travel at a walking pace. The heat inside the carriage was unbearable, and the dust from the road choked the young children. For Marie Antoinette, the failure of Versailles was the death of the monarchy's soul. They were no longer the father and mother of France. They were now viewed as fugitives who had tried to abandon their people to join an invading army. When they finally reached Paris, the silence of the crowds was more terrifying than their screams had ever been. The people were ordered not to cheer and not to boo, but to remain completely silent as the carriage passed, a sign that the king and queen were now dead to them. They were taken back to the Tuileries, but now the guards were inside the rooms. The doors were never allowed to be closed, and the queen was treated as a dangerous criminal. She began to spend her nights writing secret letters in code to her family in Austria and her friends in Europe, begging for a foreign invasion to save her family, an act that the revolutionaries would later use as the ultimate proof of her treason. She had tried to fly like a butterfly back to her home, but she had been caught in the net, and now the cage was made of iron instead of gold. The year 1792 was the year the French monarchy finally bled to death. The atmosphere in Paris had reached a boiling point, and the people's hatred for the Austrian had turned into a murderous obsession. Marie Antoinette could hear the drums of the revolution beating day and night outside the palace windows. She knew that the walls of the Tuileries were no longer enough to protect her children. On the morning of August 10th, the final storm arrived, a massive, frenzied mob of thousands, armed with pikes, muskets, and a thirst for royal blood, marched on the palace. The queen pleaded with Louis to stand and fight, to show the courage of a king, but Louis, ever the man of peace, ordered his Swiss guards not to fire on the people. It was a fatal mistake. The mob burst through the gates, and a horrific massacre began in the hallways. The queen was forced to watch as her loyal guards were torn to pieces, their blood splashing onto the very tapestries she had chosen. The royal family fled through the gardens to the National Assembly, seeking protection. But instead of protectors, they found judges. They were forced to sit for hours in a tiny, cramped reporter's box, listening to the politicians debate the end of their 1,000-year-old monarchy, while the sound of cannons and screams echoed from the palace they had just abandoned. By the end of that long, bloody day, the monarchy was abolished, and the royal family was no longer royal. They were now simply the Capids, prisoners of the state. They were taken to the Temple Tower, an ancient, medieval fortress that was cold, damp, and filled with the shadows of the past for Marie Antoinette. The transition from the silk beds of Versailles to the stone floors of a prison cell was a psychological torture that few can imagine. She was stripped of her jewels, her fine dresses were replaced by simple black cloth, and she was forced to live under the constant, mocking gaze of revolutionary guards who blew tobacco smoke in her face and insulted her children. But even in prison, her spirit remained unbroken. She spent her days teaching her daughter music and her son history, trying to maintain a shred of dignity in a world that wanted to humiliate her. The ultimate blow came in December, when the king was put on trial for high treason. Marie Antoinette was separated from him, listening through the thick stone walls to the muffled sounds of the proceedings. She knew the outcome before it was even announced. On the night of January 20th, 1793, the family was allowed one final meeting. It was a scene of heart-wrenching agony. The king sat with his wife and children for 2 hours, weeping and praying, while the guards watched them like animals in a cage. Marie Antoinette begged him not to go, to stay with them. But Louis had finally found his courage in the face of death. He made them promise to forgive his enemies, and then he was led away into the dark the next morning. The Queen heard the roar of the crowd and the heavy thud of the guillotine's blade. She collapsed in her cell, knowing that she was now a widow, and that her young son was now, in the eyes of the royalists, King Louis XVII. But her tragedy was far from over. The revolutionaries, fearing the boy would become a symbol of rebellion, decided to inflict the most cruel punishment a mother can endure in the middle of the night. Officials burst into her cell and snatched her son away from her. Marie Antoinette fought like a lioness, shielding the boy with her own body for over an hour, screaming and begging them to kill her instead. But they threatened to kill both her children if she did not step aside. She watched, broken and defeated, as her son was dragged away to a separate cell where he would be brainwashed and slowly starved to death. Marie Antoinette was now alone, her husband dead, her son stolen, and her own health rapidly failing. She was moved to the conciergerie, known as the antechamber of the guillotine, a dark, underground dungeon where the walls dripped with moisture and the air smelled of rot. She was no longer the butterfly of Versailles. She was a ghost in a black dress, waiting for her turn to face the nation that had turned her into a monster. By the autumn of 1793, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen. She was not even a prisoner of state. She was prisoner number 280, a ghost haunting the damp, rat-infested cells of the concierge, known to the people of Paris as the antechamber of the guillotine. The transition from the golden halls of Versailles to this underground dungeon was a descent into a living hell. She was kept in a small, windowless cell where the walls dripped with the moisture of the river Seine. Her only furniture was a hard cot, a wooden table, and 2 straw chairs, and she was under the constant, unblinking surveillance of 2 guards who sat behind a screen, watching her every move, even when she dressed or performed her private ablutions. Her health was rapidly failing. She suffered from constant hemorrhaging and a body racked with pain. Her famous strawberry blonde hair had turned completely white, and she had grown so thin that her black mourning dress hung loosely on her skeletal frame. But even in this wretched state, her spirit retained a spark of the Habsburg iron. She spent her days sewing scraps of fabric and praying with a small prayer book, waiting for the inevitable call of the Revolutionary Tribunal. That call finally came in the middle of the night on October 14th, when she was dragged before a room full of men who had already decided her fate. The trial of Marie Antoinette was not a pursuit of justice. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre designed to humiliate the monarchy through her person. She was accused of high treason, of depleting the national treasury, and of conspiring with foreign powers to destroy the revolution. But the most horrific and depraved moment of the trial came when the prosecutor, Jacques Hébert, accused her of the unthinkable, the sexual abuse of her own 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. The boy had been brainwashed and coerced by his jailers into signing a false confession. For a long time, Antoinette remained silent, her face a mask of cold, regal disdain, until one of the jurors demanded an answer. She stood up, her voice trembling with a primal, maternal rage that silenced the entire courtroom, and she declared, "I appeal to all mothers who may be here." Her cry was so powerful and so raw that the women in the audience, many of whom had come to scream for her blood, began to weep in sympathy for a fleeting second. It seemed as if the tide might turn, but the men of the tribunal could not afford to let her live. She was the ultimate symbol of the old world that had to be burned to the ground for the new one to rise. At 4 o'clock in the morning, after 2 days of relentless questioning without sleep, the verdict was read: death by the guillotine. Antoinette received the news with a calm that stunned her captors. She was led back to her cell, where she wrote a final, heartbreaking letter to her sister, Madame Elizabeth. She wrote of her love for her children, her forgiveness of her enemies, and her readiness to meet her God. She begged her children not to seek revenge for her death, showing a level of grace that her judges could never understand. She then cut her own hair with a pair of dull shears to prepare her neck for the blade. She put on a simple white dress, the color of mourning for French queens, and waited for the cart that would take her to the center of the city. She was no longer the butterfly of Austria. She was a woman who had been stripped of everything except her dignity. And as she stepped out of the prison into the cold morning air, she was ready to show France how a queen could die. The morning of October 16th, 1793, dawned cold, grey, and pitiless over the city of Paris. Inside the damp walls of the conciergerie, the woman who had once been the most powerful and glamorous queen in Europe was preparing for her final act. Marie Antoinette, now 37 years old, but looking like a woman of 60, sat on her hard prison cot and dressed herself for the last time. She had hoped to wear black, the color of her mourning, but the Revolutionary Tribunal had forbidden it, fearing it would provoke too much sympathy from the crowd. Instead, she put on a simple, white linen dress, a color that symbolized both her purity in the face of false accusations and the traditional mourning of French queens. She sat in silence as the executioner, Henry Sanson, entered her cell. He was the same man who had executed her husband 10 months earlier with a cold, professional efficiency. He grabbed her hands and bound them tightly behind her back with a rough rope. Then, with a pair of shears, he hacked off the remains of her white hair. The hair that had once been adorned with diamonds and feathers now fell in pathetic clumps onto the stone floor. She did not cry, she did not scream, She simply closed her eyes and accepted the humiliation with the iron discipline of a Habsburg archduchess. But the ultimate insult was yet to come. Unlike her husband, Louis, who had been allowed to travel to his execution in a closed royal carriage, Marie Antoinette was forced into a common, open hay cart. She was made to sit backwards on a hard wooden plank so that the thousands of people lining the streets could see her face. As the cart began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the Place de la Révolution, the city of Paris turned into a circus of hate. People stood on rooftops, leaned out of windows, and crowded the sidewalks, screaming the most vile obscenities at her, calling her a prostitute, a spy, and a traitor. The actor Jacques Hebert, who had accused her of unthinkable crimes during her trial, rode alongside the cart, mocking her and inciting the mob to scream louder. But Marie Antoinette sat perfectly upright, her back as straight as a spear, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. She looked past the shouting faces, past the bloody pikes, toward a world that only she could see as the cart passed the ruins of the Tuileries Palace. Her former home. She turned her head away for a single moment, a brief flicker of pain crossing her face as she remembered the life that had been stolen from her. When the cart finally reached a massive square where the guillotine stood, she climbed down the steps with a steady foot, despite her bound hands and her failing health. She looked up at the towering wooden structure, a machine of death that had become the new god of France. As she stepped onto the platform, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner in her final words, showing the impeccable grace and manners that had been bred into her since birth. She whispered, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." It was the last thing she ever said. She was seized by the executioner's assistants and strapped to the wooden plank. The heavy iron blade of the guillotine hung above her, reflecting the cold morning light for a few seconds. The roar of the crowd fell into a terrifying silence. At exactly 12:15 p.m., the blade fell, and the life of the Austrian butterfly was extinguished in a single thud. The executioner grabbed her severed head by the hair and held it high for the thousands to see, and the square erupted into a frenzied cry of "Vive la République." Her body was thrown into an unmarked common grave in the cemetery of the Madeleine, covered in quicklime to ensure that no trace of her remained to be worshipped by royalists. She had come to France as a child of 14, a symbol of hope and peace, and she left it as a corpse in a pit, a victim of a world that could not forgive her for being born a queen. But as the years turned into decades, the hatred began to fade, and the image of the woman in the white dress, standing tall against the mob, began to replace the monster of the revolutionary pamphlets. She had been a flawed woman, an unaware queen, and a tragic mother, but in her death, she found a greatness that her life had never allowed her to achieve. The French Revolution had claimed its most famous victim, but the ghost of Marie Antoinette would haunt the conscience of France for centuries to come. She was the last flame of an old world, and when she died, the darkness of the modern age truly began. Marie Antoinette's death on the guillotine was not the end of the tragedy for the House of Bourbon. It was only the beginning of a long, dark nightmare for the children she had fought so fiercely to protect. Her daughter, Marie Therese, and her young son, Louis Charles, remained trapped in the suffocating darkness of the Temple Tower, unaware for many months that both their father and their mother had been executed by the state. The fate of the young Dauphin Louis Charles would become one of the most haunting and debated mysteries in the history of France. After being snatched from his mother's arms, The 8-year-old boy was placed under the guardianship of a brutal cobbler named Antoine Simon. The revolutionaries did not want to just kill the boy. They wanted to erase his royal identity, to turn the future king of France into a common, foul-mouthed revolutionary. He was forced to drink heavy alcohol, taught to sing obscene songs about his mother, and kept in a room that was never cleaned. A room filled with rats and the stench of neglect. By 1795, the boy who had once played in the gardens of the Trianon was a hollowed-out ghost of a child, suffering from tuberculosis and covered in sores. When he finally died at the age of 10, in the lonely silence of his prison cell, a massive wave of guilt and suspicion swept across Europe. Rumors began to spread almost immediately that the boy who died in the temple was not the true prince, but a substitute. People whispered that royalist spies had managed to smuggle the real king out of the tower in a laundry basket, and that the lost Dauphin was alive somewhere in the world, waiting for the day he could reclaim his throne over the next few decades. Hundreds of men across Europe and America would step forward claiming to be the grown-up Louis Charles, including a famous bird artist named John James Audubon and a clockmaker in Prussia. But the truth remained buried in a common grave for over 200 years. It was only in the age of DNA testing that scientists examined the mummified heart of the boy who died in the prison and proved that he was indeed the tragic son of Marie Antoinette. While her son was rotting in the tower, her daughter Marie, the orphan of the temple, was living a life of absolute psychological isolation. She was the only member of the immediate royal family to survive the revolution. She spent 3 years in total silence, her only companion being a small prayer book and the memories of the family she had lost. When she was finally released in 1795 in a prisoner exchange with Austria, she was a cold, somber woman who never smiled again. She spent the rest of her life wandering through the courts of Europe as a living ghost of a dead world, a woman who carried the trauma of Versailles and the Conciergerie in her very bones. She married her cousin, the Duke of Angoulême, but the marriage was as barren and silent as her prison cell. She was often called the only man in the family by later French kings because of her iron will, and her refusal to forgive the nation that had slaughtered her parents. But Marie Antoinette's legacy was not just carried by her children. It was also carried by her secret love, Count Axel von Fersen, the Swedish soldier who had risked everything to save her. When news of her execution reached him, Fersen's soul was shattered. He became a man obsessed with revenge and consumed by a deep, dark hatred for the common people. He returned to Sweden and became a powerful but widely loathed figure, eventually being lynched by a mob in the streets of Stockholm, a fate that mirrored the violence he had tried to save the Queen from in Paris. The story of Marie Antoinette and her circle is a reminder that the fire of a revolution burns not just the guilty, but the innocent, the beautiful, and the small. The butterfly of Austria had been crushed. Her heirs had been scattered to the winds of tragedy, and the crown she had worn was melted down to fund the wars of a new emperor named Napoleon. But in the silence of the petty Trianon, where the flowers still bloom in the spring, the ghost of the woman in the white muslin dress remains. She is a warning to every power that forgets the people, and a testament to the fact that even in the face of the greatest hate, a mother's love and a queen's dignity can never be truly guillotined. The death of Marie Antoinette was intended to be the final burial of the old world, but instead it gave birth to a legend that has refused to die for over 2 centuries. For a long time, history was written by her executioners, and she was portrayed as the ultimate villain, a heartless, empty-headed woman whose greed and arrogance had brought France to its knees. The famous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she almost certainly never said, became the battle cry of those who wanted to simplify her complex tragedy into a single act of cruelty. But as the dust of the revolution settled and the centuries passed, a new image of Marie Antoinette began to emerge from the archives. She was rediscovered not as a monster, but as a deeply human and profoundly misunderstood woman who was caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a teenager who was never given the tools to be a politician, a wife who was denied intimacy for years, and a mother who saw her children snatched away by a world gone mad. In the 19th century, during the restoration of the monarchy, her remains and those of Louis XVI were exhumed from the common pit and moved to the Basilica of Saint Denis, the final resting place of French kings. But even then, she remained a figure of controversy. Today, Marie Antoinette has become a global icon of pop culture, a symbol of fashion, rebellion, and tragic beauty. She is the subject of countless movies, books, and fashion shows. Her aesthetic, the pastel colors, the towering wigs, and the delicate flowers of the Petit Trianon remains a source of endless inspiration for the world's greatest designers. We see her in the high-fashion runways of Paris and the street style of Tokyo. A woman who understood the power of image long before the age of social media. But her true legacy lies in what she teaches us about the fragility of power and the danger of isolation. She lived in a gilded bubble, surrounded by mirrors that only showed her what she wanted to see, until the day the glass was shattered by the stones of the hungry. Her story is a cautionary tale for every generation, a reminder that those who lead must also listen, and that a crown is a heavy burden that can easily become a noose. The French Revolution was a fire that cleansed the world of ancient injustices, but it also burned away the humanity of those it claimed to save. Marie Antoinette was the most famous sacrifice to that fire. A woman who was born to be a queen, but was forced to die as a martyr to a change she couldn't understand. She was the last flame of Versailles, and though her palaces are now museums, and her gowns are now dust, the ghost of the Austrian butterfly still walks the hall of mirrors. She is a reminder that behind every historical villain, there is a human heart that once beat with hope, with fear, and with a desperate desire to be loved. She was Marie Antoinette, the unwanted outsider, the fashion icon, the tragic mother, and finally, the eternal queen of our imagination. The revolution may have claimed her head, but it could never guillotine her legend. Her name will forever be written in the stars of Versailles and the shadows of the Concierge. A woman who began as a pawn and ended as a masterpiece of history, as the final echoes of the guillotine's blade fade into the past. We are left with the image of a woman in a white dress, standing tall against the roar of a nation. Marie Antoinette's story is a tragedy of errors, a collision between a dying world of absolute power and a new world of radical equality. She was a woman who lived for beauty and died for a system she didn't create.